History is filled with strange and unsettling events, moments so bizarre they feel like they've been plucked from a fever dream. We've heard tales of mad kings, bizarre wars, and inexplicable phenomena. But what if I told you that one of the most grotesque and surreal events in history didn't take place on a battlefield or in a madman's court, but in the heart of the Catholic Church, presided over by the Pope himself? Imagine a grand basilica, filled with the highest-ranking clergy in Christendom. Imagine a throne not occupied by a living ruler, but by a 9-month-old corpse, rotting and decaying, dressed in the most sacred papal vestments. This wasn't a horror movie. This was a real trial. A trial where the defendant was a dead man, the prosecutor was the living pope, and the verdict would unleash chaos across Europe. This is the story of the Cadaver Synod, the time a pope dug up his predecessor's body, put it on trial, and unleashed a chain of events so dark and twisted it would forever stain the annals of history. How could this possibly happen? Why would anyone put a corpse on trial? The answer is a venomous cocktail of political ambition, personal hatred, and a desperate struggle for power that consumed Rome in one of its darkest eras. To understand this macabre spectacle, we must first meet the man in the dock, the corpse who would become the most infamous defendant in religious history, Pope Formosus. Before he was a pope, and long before he was a defendant, Formosus was a brilliant and ambitious bishop. He was known for his successful missionary work, particularly in Bulgaria, where he was so effective that the Bulgarian king personally requested that Formosus be appointed as their archbishop. This was a man on the rise, a charismatic figure making waves within the church. However, his ambition and influence made him powerful enemies. The reigning pope at the time, Pope John VIII, saw Formosus not as an asset but as a threat. He feared Formosus's growing power base and political connections. In 872, a synod was convened, and a series of accusations were leveled against Formosus. He was charged with conspiring against the Pope, attempting to seize the papacy for himself, and violating church law by deserting his own see to meddle in Bulgarian affairs. The punishment was swift and severe. Formosus was excommunicated, stripped of his holy orders, and cast out of the church. It seemed his career was over, a cautionary tale of flying too close to the sun. But in the turbulent world of 9th century Rome, fortunes could change in the blink of an eye. After Pope John VIII's death, his successor, Pope Marinus I, reinstated Formosus. His excommunication was lifted, his bishopric restored. Formosus was back in the game. Over the next decade, he navigated the treacherous political landscape, and in the year 891, the once excommunicated bishop achieved the ultimate prize. He was elected pope. As Pope Formosus, he was thrust into the center of a geopolitical firestorm. The Carolingian Empire, the great dominion forged by Charlemagne, was crumbling. It had fractured into rival kingdoms, and two powerful factions were vying for the ultimate prize, the title of Holy Roman Emperor, a title only the Pope could bestow. On one side were the Spoltans, a powerful Italian dynasty led by Guy of Spoleto and his son Lambert. They controlled Rome and exerted immense pressure on the papacy. They essentially forced Pope Formosus to crown Guy as emperor, and later his son Lambert as co-emperor. But Formosus deeply distrusted the Spoltans. He saw them as local tyrants, and he looked for a way to break their grip on Rome and the papacy. He found his champion in Arnulf of Carinthia, the powerful king of East Francia, a descendant of Charlemagne. Secretly, Formosus invited Arnulf to invade Italy, liberate Rome from the Spoltans, and claim the imperial crown for himself. In 896, Arnulf's army marched on Rome, captured the city, and Pope Formosus did the unthinkable. He crowned Arnulf as the new Holy Roman Emperor, effectively declaring his previous crowning of Lambert null and void. This was a colossal political gamble. Formosus had betrayed the powerful Spoleto family, and they would never forgive him. But just as his plan seemed to be succeeding, fate intervened in the most final way possible. Only a few months after crowning his chosen emperor, Pope Formosus died. His death left a power vacuum, and the city of Rome plunged into chaos. The stage was now set for his accuser, the man who would orchestrate the most bizarre trial in history, Pope Stephen VI. Stephen's rise to the papacy was a direct result of the political turmoil Formosus had unleashed. After Formosus's death, there was a brief 15-day reign by a Pope Boniface VI, but he died suddenly, likely from gout or poisoning. Then, with the backing of the enraged and vengeful Spalito family, Stephen was elected. The Spoltans, particularly the formidable Empress Ageltrude, Lambert's mother, had regained control of Rome after Arnulf suffered a stroke and was forced to withdraw his army. They had their puppet on the papal throne, and they wanted revenge. They didn't just want to erase Formosus's political legacy. They wanted to annihilate his very memory, to retroactively destroy everything he had ever done. Their goal was simple and brutal: invalidate the coronation of their rival, Arnulf. To do that, they needed to prove that Formosus was never a legitimate pope. And to do that, Pope Stephen VI, under immense pressure from his patrons, decided on a course of action so extreme, so sacrilegious, that it still beggars belief nearly 12 centuries later. He would put the dead pope on trial. The year is 897. 9 months have passed since Formosus was laid to rest in St. Peter's Basilica. On a grim morning, under the orders of Pope Stephen VI, a group of men entered the hallowed crypts. They located the tomb of Pope Formosus and broke it open. The stench of decay filled the air as they hauled the decomposing corpse from its final resting place. The body was in a state of advanced decay, a grotesque mockery of the once powerful man. But this was only the beginning of the horror. The corpse was taken and prepared for its day in court. Servants, likely recoiling in disgust, stripped the body of its burial shrouds and dressed it in the full, magnificent vestments of the papacy. The silken robes, the ornate pallium, the papal tiara, all were placed upon the rotting flesh. They propped the body upright, making it look as lifelike as possible, a ghastly puppet ready for its showy trial. The scene then moved to the Basilica of St. John Lateran, the mother church of all of Christendom. Inside, the bishops, cardinals, and nobles of Rome were assembled. They sat in stunned, terrified silence. They knew this was a perversion of justice, a sacrilegious act, but they were powerless to stop it. The Spoltans and their armed guards were everywhere, ensuring the proceedings went according to their twisted plan. Then came the grand entrance. The corpse of Pope Formosus was carried into the basilica and placed upon a throne, positioned to face his accuser. Pope Stephen VI, in his own papal finery, sat opposite him, his face a mask of fury. The trial began. Stephen rose to his feet and began to scream accusations at the silent, decaying figure on the throne. He raged at the corpse, demanding answers. Why did you, while you were Bishop of Porto, usurp the universal Roman See in your ambition? He bellowed. The charges were read out, the same ones that had been used to excommunicate Formosus years earlier. That he had committed perjury, that he had illegally transitioned from one bishopric to another, and that he had coveted the papacy. In the surreal theater of the absurd, a young deacon, barely more than a boy, was forced to stand behind the corpse. His job was to act as the defense attorney for the dead. Trembling with fear, he would meekly whisper responses on behalf of the silent defendant, his voice barely audible over Stephen's furious tirades. The clergy watched in horror as their supreme leader interrogated a rotting body. They saw the vacant eye sockets, the discolored, peeling skin, the rigid posture of a man 9 months dead. The stench of death mixed with the scent of incense, creating a nauseating atmosphere of holy terror. The outcome was, of course, a foregone conclusion. The court, under the watchful eye of the Spalito faction, found the corpse of Pope Formosus guilty on all charges. The verdict was read, and the punishment was immediate and horrific. Pope Stephen VI declared that Formosus had never been a legitimate pope. All of his acts, all of his ordinations, all of his decrees were declared null and void. With a single pronouncement, Stephen had plunged the entire church into chaos. Priests and bishops ordained by Formosus were suddenly no longer considered legitimate clergy. The sacred rites they had performed, the baptisms, the marriages, the last rites were all cast into doubt. The spiritual fabric of thousands of lives was torn apart, but the vengeance was not yet complete. The verdict was not enough. The body had to be desecrated. Stephen, in a fit of rage, ordered his guards to strip the papal vestments from the corpse. They tore the sacred fabrics from the decaying body, leaving it exposed and humiliated. Then, Stephen personally oversaw the most symbolic act of mutilation. He ordered a guard to take a knife and hack off the 3 fingers of Formosus's right hand, the index, middle, and ring fingers. These were the fingers of benediction, the fingers a pope used to bless the faithful and to consecrate new clergy. By severing them, Stephen was symbolically erasing every blessing Formosus had ever given, every priest he had ever made. The mutilated corpse was then dragged from the throne and out of the basilica. It was hauled through the streets of Rome, a horrifying spectacle for the terrified populace. The common people, deeply superstitious, watched in shock as the desecrated body of a former Holy Father was treated like common refuse. The grim procession ended at the banks of the Tiber River. There, with one final act of contempt, the guards threw the body of Pope Formosus into the murky water to be washed away and forgotten. The Cadaver Synod was over. Pope Stephen VI and his Spolito masters had achieved their revenge. But in doing so, they had unleashed a storm of fury that would consume them all. The people of Rome were not just disgusted, they were terrified. They believed this act of ultimate sacrilege had angered God himself. Their fears seemed to be confirmed when, shortly after the synod, a powerful earthquake struck the city. The ground shook violently, and the roof of the Basilica of St. John Lateran, the very place where the grotesque trial had been held, collapsed, killing several people. To the citizens of Rome, this was no coincidence. It was a clear sign of divine wrath. The public mood, already simmering with resentment against the tyrannical Spolitans, boiled over. The chaos Stephen had created within the church by invalidating Formosus's ordinations caused widespread anger and confusion among the clergy. Priests who had served faithfully for years were suddenly told they were nothing, their life's work undone. Factions loyal to the memory of Formosus began to plot their revenge. The tide had turned against Pope Stephen VI. The man who had sat in judgment over a corpse now found himself the target of a city's rage. A popular uprising swept through Rome. Stephen's guards were overwhelmed, and he was captured by an angry mob. He was thrown into a dungeon, stripped of his papal dignity, and left to await his fate. In August of 897, just a few months after his ghoulish trial, Stephen VI was found dead in his cell. He had been strangled to death. The prosecutor had met a swifter, and perhaps more merciful, end than his victim. The downfall of Stephen did not end the saga. The story of the Cadaver Synod entered a new, equally chaotic chapter of reversals and rehabilitations. Stephen's successor, Pope Romanus, reversed the synod's decisions, but he himself was deposed after only a few months. Then came Pope Theodore II. During his incredibly brief reign of just 20 days, he formally annulled the proceedings of the Cadaver Synod. He declared Formosus to have been a legitimate pope and reinstated all of his acts and ordinations. And then he ordered a search for Formosus's body. Legend has it that the corpse, which had been thrown into the Tiber, washed ashore and was discovered by a fisherman who was guided by a miraculous vision. Whether by miracle or by mundane recovery, the body of Formosus was found. Pope Theodore II gave the much-abused corpse a proper funeral. Dressed once again in papal vestments, the body of Formosus was carried in a solemn procession back to St. Peter's Basilica and reinterred in its tomb, finally at peace. But the political seesaw continued. The next pope, John IX, held his own synods to formally condemn the Cadaver Synod. He not only reaffirmed Formosus's legitimacy, but also had all the records of the trial burned. Crucially, he passed a new canon law that explicitly forbade any future trials of the dead. The Church, it seemed, had learned its lesson. It had stared into an abyss of its own making and pulled back, horrified by what it saw. The Cadaver Synod, or the *Synodus Horrenda as it came to be known, stands as a chilling monument to the depths of human depravity when fueled by political power and personal hatred. It represents the absolute lowest point of the papacy, a period so corrupt and violent that historians call it the Saeculum Obscurum Asterisk, the Dark Age of the Papacy. It's a story that reveals how the most sacred institutions can be hijacked by the most profane motives. It's a reminder that beneath the magnificent robes and holy rituals, history is driven by raw, often brutal human emotions, ambition, fear, and above all, a thirst for vengeance so powerful it could reach beyond the grave. The image of a rotting corpse on a throne, being screamed at by the most powerful religious figure in the Western world, is not just a bizarre historical footnote. It's a timeless and terrifying warning about the dangers of absolute power and the madness that can ensue when justice becomes a tool for the powerful. And even death itself offers no escape from their wrath.